At length, my mother would say to me, "Now, don't stay here all day. You can go up to your room if you are too hot, if you are too hot outside, but get a little fresh air first. Don't start reading immediately after your food." And I would go and sit down beside the pump in its trough, ornamented here and there like a Gothic font, with a salamander, which impressed on the rough stone the mobile relief of its tapering allegorical body. On the bench without a back, in the shade of a lilac tree, in that little corner of the garden which opened through a service door onto the Rue de Saint-Esprit, and from whose neglected soil there rose in two stages, jutting out from the house itself, and as it were a separate building, my aunt's back kitchen. One could see its red tile floor gleaming like porphyry. It seemed not so much the cave of Françoise as a little temple of Venus. It would be overflowing with the offerings of the dairyman, the fruiterer, the greengrocer, come sometimes from distant villages to dedicate to the goddess the first fruits of their fields. And its roof was always crowned with a cooing dove. In earlier days, I did not linger in the sacred grove which surrounded this temple, for before going upstairs to read, I used to steal into the little sitting room that my uncle Adolf, a brother of my grandfather and an old soldier who had retired from the service as a major, occupied on the ground floor. A room which, even when its opened windows let in the heat, if not actually the rays of the sun which seldom penetrated so far, would never fail to admit that oddly cool odor, suggestive at once of woodlands and the Ancien Régime, which sets the nostrils quivering when one goes into an abandoned shooting lodge. But for some years now, I had not gone into my Uncle Adolphe's sanctum, for he no longer came to Cambrai on account of a quarrel which had arisen between him and my family, through my fault, in the following circumstances. Once or twice a month in Paris, I used to be sent to pay him a visit, as he was finishing his luncheon, wearing a plain alpaca coat and waited upon by his manservant in a working jacket of striped linen, purple and white. He would complain that I had not been to see him for a long time, that he was being neglected. He would offer me a biscuit or a tangerine, and we would go through a drawing room in which no one ever sat, whose fire was never lighted, whose walls were decorated with gilded moldings, its ceiling painted blue in imitation of the sky, and its furniture upholstered in satin, as at my grandparents', only yellow. Then we would enter what he called his study, a room whose walls were hung with prints which showed against a dark background a plump and rosy goddess driving a chariot, or standing upon a globe, or wearing a star on her brow. Pictures which were popular under the Second Empire because there was thought to be something about them that suggested Pompeii, which were then generally despised and which are now becoming fashionable again for one single and consistent reason, notwithstanding all the others that are advanced, namely that they suggest the Second Empire. And there I would stay with my uncle until his man came with a message from the coachman, asking him at what time he would like the carriage. My uncle would then become lost in meditation, while his servant stood there agape, not daring to disturb him by the least movement, curiously awaiting his answer, which never varied. For in the end, after a supreme crisis of hesitation, my uncle would utter infallibly the words, 2:15, which the servant would echo with amazement, but without disputing them. 2:15, very good, sir, I'll go and tell him. At this date, I was a lover of the theater, a platonic lover, since my parents had not yet allowed me to enter one, and so inaccurate was the picture I had formed in my mind's eye of the pleasures to be enjoyed there, that I almost believed each of the spectators looked, as through a stereoscope, at a scene that existed for himself alone, though similar to the 1,000 other scenes presented to the rest of the audience individually. Every morning I would hasten to the Morris column to see what new plays it announced. Nothing could be more disinterested or happier than the daydreams with which these announcements filled my imagination. Daydreams which were conditioned by the associations of the words forming the titles of the plays, and also by the color of the bills, still damp and wrinkled with paste, on which those words stood out. Nothing, unless it were such strange titles as Testament de César Girardot or Oedipus Rex, inscribed not on the green bills of the Opéra Comique, but on the wine-colored bills of the Comédie Française. Nothing seemed to me to differ more profoundly from the sparkling white plume of the Diamant de la Couronne than the sleek, mysterious satin of the Domino Noir. And since my parents had told me that, for my first visit to the theater, I should have to choose between these two pieces, I would study exhaustively and in turn the title of one and the title of the other. for these were all that I knew of either, attempting to snatch from each a foretaste of the pleasure it promised, and to compare this with the pleasure latent in the other, until in the end I succeeded in conjuring up such vivid and compelling pictures of, on the one hand, a play of dazzling arrogance, and on the other a gentle, velvety play, that I was as little capable of deciding which of them I should prefer to see if, at the dinner table, I had been obliged to choose between rice à la impératrice and the famous crème of chocolat. All my conversations with my friends bore upon actors, whose art, although as yet I had no experience of it, was the first of all its numberless forms in which art itself allowed me to anticipate its enjoyment. Between one actor's tricks of intonation and inflection and another's, the most trifling differences would strike me as being of an incalculable importance. And from what I had been told of them, I would arrange them in order of talent in lists which I used to recite to myself all day, and which ended up by hardening in my brain and hampering it by their immovability. And later, in my school days, whenever I ventured in class, as soon as the master's head was turned, to communicate with some new friend, I'd always begin by asking him whether he had already been to the theater, and whether he agreed that our greatest actor was Got, our second Delaunay, and so on. And if, in his judgment, Fèvre came below Tyran, or Delaunay below Coquelin, the sudden volatility which the name of Coquelin, forsaking its stony rigidity, would acquire in my mind in order to move up to second place the miraculous agility, the fecund animation with which the name Delaunay would suddenly be endowed, to enable it to slip down to fourth, would stimulate and fertilize my brain with a sense of budding and blossoming life. But if the thought of actors preoccupied me so, if the sight of Maubant coming out of the Théâtre Français one afternoon had plunged me into the throes and sufferings of love, how much more did the name of a star blazing outside the doors of the theater, how much more, seen through the window of a brougham, passing by the streets, its horses' headbands decked with roses, did the face of a woman who I took to be an actress leave me in a state of troubled excitement, impotently and painfully trying to form a picture of her private life. I classified the most distinguished in order of talent: Sarah Bernhardt, Burma, Barthé, Madeleine Brohan, Jean Saint-Marie, but I was interested in them all. Now my uncle knew many of them personally, and also ladies of another class, not certainly distinguishes from actresses in my mind. He used to entertain them at his house, and if we went to see him on certain days only, that was because on the other days ladies might come whom his family could not very well have met, so they at least thought, for my uncle, on the contrary, was only too willing to pay pretty widows, who had perhaps never been married, and countesses whose high-sounding titles were probably no more than nom de guerre, the compliment of presenting them to my grandmother, or even of presenting to them some of the family jewels, a propensity which had already embroiled him in more than once with my grandfather. Often, if the name of some actress were mentioned in conversation, I would hear my father say to my mother with a smile, "One of your uncle's friends," and thinking of the weary and fruitless novitiate eminent men would go through, perhaps for years on end, on the doorstep of some such lady who refused to answer their letters and had them sent packing by the hall porter, it struck me that my uncle could have spared from such torments a youngster like me by introducing him to the actress, unapproachable by all the world, who was for him an intimate friend.